Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Dungeons and Drama Nerds. My name is Todd Backus, and today I'm joined by Jon Jon Johnson.
Hello.
Our GM for Apocalypse World. JonJon is a multidisciplinary theater artist and TTRPG veteran, and today we'll be talking about theater, tabletop, and how to GM a good game. So, JonJon, can you talk to me a little bit about your background as a theater artist and what that means for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I went and studied theater at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And one of the things while I was there, I was like, I want to learn all the languages because one day I want to direct and I want to be able to speak to everyone in a language they understood rather than forcing everyone to speak my language. So I actually, I did not finish college. I had to drop out for financial reasons. And then while I was working at Bertucci's in Tyson's Corner, I had someone, I had helped a little bit with the setting up of First Stage in Tyson's Corner as it was coming into existence, since their founding artistic director was my high school theater teacher. And so I wound up there for the first read where someone couldn't attend. I read for his part since I was there by sort of happenstance. And a week later, the stage manager came into my bar and was like, hey, do you want that role? We fired that guy. It was a play we had done in high school, so I already knew the play. I was familiar with it. So I was like, you know what? Like, why not? Let's do it. And that thus began my professional theater career back in 2008. So I've been working in theater for the past 12 years, and everything from, I've directed, I've mostly acted, but I'm swinging more into the directing field now. I've written a couple plays, none of them produced on major stages outside of Fringe, and a couple readings, but I'm very proud of them. And a lot of my work has come as a musician and like sort of composer, like actor muso. So a lot of I'm pretty well known, I think, for being that guy what plays the violin on stage. Yeah, and so that's been my theatrical background. More and more, I've been pushing more into directing. Recently, having directed Yellowface at Silver Spring Stage, assistant directed Museum 2040 with 4615 Theater Company, and I've done a couple online readings. The Body is a Vessel by Britt Willis recently, and Edward II with Brave Spirits. So trying to been figuring out Zoom readings and like what I like and don't like about them.
I remember when we were just starting to record Apocalypse World, you had this lighting rig set up in front of your Zoom station because you had just been involved in a reading and you were trying to figure out some of that, and that was really nifty.
What was it? Dance on the Railroad with Adventure Theater by David Henry Hwang. So it was fun. I got to meet David Henry Hwang.
Awesome. And now I know that you and Percy are both from the DC theater scene, and as someone who lives in Portland, Maine now, and was most familiar with the New York scene, because that's where I did a bunch of work, can you talk a little bit about that and those dynamics and anything that you think is unique about the DC theater scene?
The DC theater scene is something I love about it, and I've talked about this with a lot of my friends, is that it is a surprisingly expansive community, but with a small community feel. There is a pretty definite rift between equity and non-equity, both in terms of houses and personnel for the most part. But I feel like everyone knows everyone, or at least knows of. So it feels like a small community, and I feel like we're pretty good about sharing personnel, passing people along. There's a decent amount of resource sharing. I want there to be more, but there's some pretty good resource sharing. It is one that is evolving and growing, and I think recently it's hit a lot of growing pains with you looking at the emergence of We're Watching You, White American Theater, and oh my god, finally. And then I was like, because I've been someone who's been yelling about diversity, equity, inclusivity, and belonging for much of my career, because it's been marked by several events that are like, kind of like racist, and I'm like, and at a certain point I stopped being quiet about it and have been speaking up on social media, and then now it's gotten to the point where happily and finally, like, I'm speaking up in the rehearsal rooms being like, that's not cool, And I think I have somewhat of a reputation for typically being pretty gentle and understanding and kind about it, which is a double-edged sword because now, like now people are sort of coming to me unsolicited being like, I need advice on like my racism. And I'm like, I'm not here to absolve you. I'm not. It's also really, really like, can you please do some research before asking me to educate you? Like that. So that's a lot of like that insistence now and making sure I'm setting up healthy boundaries for myself. Yeah, so that's the DC theater scene. I think we've hit a really, really hard learning curve where a lot of people need to get educated. And, they're going to be like, oh my God, it's happening so fast. But I'm going to keep gently pointing out that it's been happening this whole time. You're just behind. And so it's not that it's steep or hard. You just you weren't listening before and now you need to catch up because we're going to leave you behind otherwise. So that's fun. Like, because I look at I read the demands recently for We're Watching You at American Theater, and I was simultaneously elated and exhausted because I was like, oh my God, we BIPOC folk have so much work to do now because no one's going to hold white American theater accountable. And except for us now, and like because I don't trust them to hold themselves accountable just yet. So it's like, okay, well, we have a lot of work to do, and I'm already exhausted for it. But here we go. So that's how I feel about DC theater scene right now.
No, I think that's entirely fair, and I think there's a lot of people doing some soul searching who thought they were doing the work before and clearly have not been doing the work. And I think that it's important for people to recognize what they have been doing, which has been good or bad, but also how everyone could be doing much, much better.
Yeah, and it's going to be a lot of work for everyone. And again, I am excited for it. Like I am very curious to meet this next iteration of the DC theater community and how it will have grown from all this. I am like not cautiously optimistic. I'm like optimistic, but also prepared for it not to change very much, in which case I'll be angrily optimistic. But like, I don't know. I have faith that the community can change and grow, and I'm going to keep yelling at all of us to continue to do so.
Well, and I think that like this all happening right now when everything has to be shut down, like when we can no longer safely gather, being able to take this time not to just like moan about not being able to do theater the way that we've traditionally done theater, but taking time to actually say like, hey, we have a lot of time on our hands. Let's think about how we can do better. Like we are all currently a bit removed from the grind of trying to pay rent on our theater spaces and like making sure like most theaters had already announced their seasons or were about to announce their seasons when COVID-19 hit the States as hard as it did. And like, I'm hopeful, I'm not certain, but I'm hopeful that these conversations and this time of not being able to do theater the way that we were planning on doing theater forces people to reckon with the ways that they could be doing better.
Oh, yeah. It's also a testament to the theater community, right? Where it's like when we have like when we're not working ourselves to death in, these very low paid, sometimes unsafe environments, like we have all this energy and all this power. And so, it's a joke among my friend group to say that, the revolution needs production managers, right? And like when all these theater folk have the energy and drive to do something, change happens. And that's something that I want to keep harping on people as well, is that like you look at what happened up at the Flea in New York, right? Where it's like the company banded together and made demands, and now hopefully, change is coming. And I think everyone in the theater community, I keep pointing people to the Flea and from DC being like, look, that's what we can do. We have that power. Let's start changing it and let's stop being so underfoot. That's DC theater community.
Well, segueing from there, can you talk a little bit about your experience as a GM? maybe some of the systems that you've played in, how long you've been doing it, what are some of the things that you really enjoy about that?
Yeah, so for me, I've been GMing or MCing for like about 4 years. You know, I got into D&D like way back when, like I want to say in like elementary school when we played an after school program, and then like at a summer camp. Like, so I was playing, and you had all those pre-made character cards with all the cool art. I want to say it was like an advanced D&D, and we couldn't make heads or tails of it for the most part because we were little kids without adults telling us what all the numbers meant. And then later again in summer camp, you know, I was playing a Ravenloft campaign that I jumped into somewhere in the middle, so I was completely lost. But they were like, "Hey, you like this? You should play." And like, I'm a paladin. I don't know what that means, and so I was just like, "I'm gonna hit something with my sword. I can apparently cast Mass Psychic Drain. What is it? I don't know what's going on." So, you know, I was thrown into tabletops like pretty young, and then like has slowly worked to figure it out because it was a nice challenge. Then I kind of dropped it for a long time because I was like, "Oh, I gotta focus on adult things," and so I was like, "Oh man, I need to focus on like school and work and etc." Because like I had to pay my way through college for the most part. Then it was like a couple years back, my friend was like, "Do you want to play some Dungeon World?" And I was like, "Sure, sounds great." And I was like, "Oh, this is like really simplified D&D that focuses on the storytelling." And I was so charmed by the storytelling aspect and the fail to improve system that I was like, "Oh, this is delightful." And so, you know, we only played a few sessions, but it was enough for me to turn that like sort of initial seedlings into a full novel on my own time that I'm still working on. I've just been like, because I was like, oh man, like I go back and forth. I'm like, oh my god, it's so like cliche and passe to turn your campaign into a novel. Oh, everyone does that. And I'm like, but they're all so different and unique, and I want to read everyone's novels based off their campaign, so like I should do it. And so, and I thought the DM built a really delightful, simple world and was really giving towards the backstories that we as the characters had created. And that was like, oh, right. Collaborative storytelling is something I'm super into, as, you know, having been a deviser in DC theater, being, you know, someone who loves creating with people collaboratively and from scratch. So I was running different little one-shots here and there. And then it was actually when I was still with Flying V, back when I was a company member, they did something called the Awesome Thon, which was like 24 hours of programming. And I was tapped to do the like late night D&D. So I built a Dungeon World session that was for like, they were like, "We don't know how many people you're going to have." Like, we didn't do signups or anything. So I was like, okay, I will prep 20 character sheets so people have, like, if I get like 4 people to come at 3 a.m, then like, you know, they'll have a nice array of things to choose from, and I'll do all the setup work for them. So I built like 20 characters, and then 17 people showed up. So one of my first big DMing experiences was DMing a room of 17 people. I was like, oh my goodness, this is, oh. But from there, you know, a couple people were like, "I really liked your DM style. You know, it's quirky. It's a little, you know, it's fun." And it's like, and so they're like, "We would love if you ran a Dungeon World campaign for us." And so I grabbed a couple people, and like, because I'm like almost psychotically inclusive, I'm like, let's immediately go into Western Marches. Like, no traditional campaign, like it's episodic, and whoever's available, you know, they're deployed on that mission, right? And so I built one of the first facets of what became the JonJon shared universe, right? I called it the 6 Kingdoms of Yulia, who shows up in our Apocalypse World game, right? But so Yulia's been there for a long time for me. 6 Kingdoms of Yulia, and I actually built the 6 kingdoms based on the 6 colors of magic, or rather the 5 colors of magic and the one colorless. So like, you had the swamp, you had the island, you had the forest and the mountain and the plains. And I was like, since I'm a queer BIPOC creator, the world was filled with queer POC, like to as much as I could, because I was like, this is something I find sorely lacking in fantasy that I consume. Like I was like, I love Lord of the Rings, but it's like the closest thing you got to people of color is orcs, and I was like, and I feel some kind of way about that.
Yep.
I'm playing Skyrim right now, and I'm like, man, you can't marry any men of color. The closest thing you can marry to a man of color is an orc, so I married an orc. And I was like, fine. So I'm always I dislike that about fantasy, so I was like, well, I can be the change I seek. And so that Six Kingdoms of Yulia was filled to the brim with queer POC, and I tried to make a very sex positive world, so people was like, not like explicit, but just like, hey, I want to seduce this bartender, and then I'm like, cool, you get something. They actually share some information with you, or spill it, like in the post-coital talk, and you get some information. So like, and sort of like if people weren't interested in that, I'm like, cool, it's there if you want it, but like I'm not going to force you into having sex with my NPCs. That's also kind of weird. Totally. But building a sex positive world, building a queer friendly world, and I was like, this is very rejuvenating for me. And so then from there I went on to build what is called the Shepherds of Cathan, which is still ongoing, about 2-year-old Western Marches campaign using D&D 5e. And that began as an experiment where I was like, I've never DM'd 5e, so here, I'm going to run a 1-shot, maybe 2-shot, and let's see if it works. And then it just grew up from there. And I was like, great. Like, I look back at the Facebook group that I used to schedule, and I'm like, well, it even says there, like, this little experiment that might be 1 or 2 shots. I'm like, oh, we are at shot, like, 170 now. And it's like, ooh, because of just massive scheduling. And then, like,
that's impressive.
I pulled in a bunch of other people, so we rotate DMs, and then we, like, split up the world so that everyone has their, like, everyone's running storylines. We have showrunners running individual characters, so making sure that those stories are being developed. So it's a lot of collaborative work and a lot of yes-anding. And so that's my tabletop role-playing game experience. The big ones are Dungeon World and 5e.
I mean, I was really impressed because I got to sit in on our session 0 for Apocalypse World. And as someone who has only played with a couple different people and has only listened to a couple different DMs really like start from scratch, it was really, really inspiring getting to listen to you setting up the world of the game that we played and that we'll get back to next week. On the next episode of Dungeons and Dragons. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the specifics there for you about this like devisey collaborative storytelling, because I just thought it was really cool getting to hear the very gentle way you introduced things that we could or couldn't have stories about, depending on the feeling of the group, and how you made that a really open invitation for people to talk about, like, what is the game that we want to play, and how will we play it? So if you could talk a little bit about that. It seemed to me, so clearly from a devising background, Percy and I were like messaging each other in the chat, like, oh, this is what every game should be. This is like how theater should work. This is so cool. So if you can talk a little bit about that and what like brought you to that structure. Because I thought it was just like a masterclass.
Oh, thank you. So it began with the aforementioned Dungeon World and D&D campaign I was mentioning. Is that I have, in the tabletop world, I have now like played and DM'd and been DM'd by so many different people, and also having done a lot of devising and a lot of very collaborative storytelling in the theater world. It's for me, it's a lot about managing and balancing expectations, because that's where that's where you get people to buy into your world and also challenge it, which is something I'm always interested in. Like I want people to challenge my ideas, and that's sort of like comes from my directing philosophy of decolonizing the director position, where it's like I don't want to hold all the power, and so in this case, I am less interested in like I want to tell a story, but I don't want to map it all out, because I only have a singular viewpoint and a singular lens. And sort of the strength of collaboration is that we have so many different lenses. viewing the same sort of lump of clay. And for me, it's less about the finished product at the end. It's like, what is this story gonna be? That's the exciting part, not the finished story. And so I love getting other people's viewpoints and perspectives. I love asking what people want out of this, you know? So, like, even if I were the person casting a show or casting and devising a show, everyone's going to have a different viewpoint on what they want the show to be, you know? And I think that's the same with the tabletop game. It's like, some people really want, you know, just to have the railroads down and to be taken along on a story. And, like, I can do that. If that's what the group had decided, they were like, no, we really want you to steer, then I would have been like, okay, then there is a plot and we're going to follow it. And I will put in mechanisms to keep everything sort of on that straight and narrow. But I'm very inspired by people. And, you know, like I want, and I am at my best when I'm collaborating. So I think I did that in session 0 and in session 1, where I was like, here's the skeleton of the world I've built. There's just a little bit of information about all these places. And then, because I'm mostly interested in seeing what people latch onto. And so, you know, T latched onto the maitre d' class and the sort of that whole world. I can't even remember what I called it now in the game, but it's like, you know, it's in the metro car area, and they turn metro cars into restaurants and clubs and the like. And so she took that and built Vector, and Z had Zier's own metro car. And I was like, oh, okay, so this is fantastic. So. And that's also the secret. I had to do no work. Like, I just set something up and someone ran with it. And I went, great. Like, now it's as one of my friends who is an excellent DM says, it's all about hooks and knives from people's backstories. And so it's like, oh, you've given me hooks, you've given me knives. And so I don't need to force slam you into a story of my making. You've planted a seed, and all I need to do is nurture it. You know, so now that's why Vector's story becomes one of, like, Z is very suspicious of anyone who comes from Z's past, you know, and Z is also worried that people are trying to take Z's business, you know, so it's like, ooh. So trying to, like, it's more interesting to me to see what a character finds important and working with that. And so that's how I build. And then the session 0 safety mechanisms, you know, we go back to session 0. It's because I value everyone's collaboration, and because I value the people who are playing, I want to make sure that they are in a place where they can have fun. And getting hurt is no fun. You know, right. As an actor, I know all about transference, right? I have been in roles where it's like, this character has seeped into my psyche because I'm living in them. And I know how joyous that can be, but also how damaging that can be. So how do we build safety mechanisms? Because, like, you know, we talk about sexual assault, you know, and it's like, that is triggering for so many people, you know, and I was like, and I was also annoyed at, you know, how often in fantasy and in, like, sci-fi, it's like, or in, like, gritty sci-fi, it's like, this is a plot point and this is character development. And I'm like, but it doesn't have to be. You know, it doesn't always have to be that, you know, so knowing my philosophy on that versus how many people, you know, are survivors of it, I'm like, this is not something we really want in our game, but it's not something I want, but let's also check with the group and make sure that we're all on the same page, you know, it's like, and then again, because we had such a queer group, I was like, let's talk about, you know, homophobia and transphobia, because we don't want that in our game. Because, you know, even though we are a slight degree removed to our characters, they're still human beings behind them, you know, so, like, there's a reason there's not really racism in my worlds, because it's something I experience pretty much daily. So I'm like, why do I want to experience that in my fantasy? This is my power fantasy.
Totally.
So, you know, just making sure with the group where it's like, let's not go into these things. You know, and then, you know, that's why if I do bring up racism in a game, it's spoiler alert, I use it as a teaching moment with my white friends where it's like, hey, white friends, you're going to experience fantasy racism now, you know, and, you know, sort of like now you can use your empathy and be like, oh man, I as an elf am being discriminated. And you sort of get it a little bit. You get that sting. But, like, that's what session 0 is for. It's like, do we even bring that up? Because, like, and this group was like, nah, let's not. I was like, great, let's not then. It's not going to happen. And that's important to me, to make sure that, you know, like good BDSM and good theater, you know, you make sure that boundaries are set so that everyone can have the maximum enjoyment. at the end of the day, it's a game, and we're here to have fun and tell a story, and session 0 and that sort of negotiation, the sort of verbal contract explains to us how far we can go in certain areas. And I believe in collaboration, there is also, it's very helpful for me, because when you look at building a world from scratch, you have an infinite number of doors, and so for I call it the paralysis of limitless choice, where it's like you have every option, and therefore you don't know where to go. And it really helps for people to start closing doors for me, because then I can start to see what shape it's going to take. And then I say, okay, these are doors we can traverse. These are pathways we can take to tell this story. And so with this group in particular, building the world, they were like, we had 4 very disparate sort of characters who were sort of loosely tied to each other. So that's why I thought, let's build a sandbox, because there is no one unifying plot that will pull all of them together immediately. But I bet we'll find it if I just give them something to play in. And it was about sort of juggling what everyone needed from this world that I had built the skeleton for, but they filled out. They put the meat on it, right? And so then together we were putting the skin. I get that's a weird metaphor for our Frankenstein world, but like session 0 is just like is the contract for me. It's like what can we do, what can't we do as a group, and like understanding in a weird way. I feel like I need to explain it. Like just because we can't do it doesn't mean we've limited our freedom any. Like it is like, yes, we can't do it, but that's because we agreed upon it as a group. And so it's not some outside force saying like, you cannot do this. It's us being like, we as a group have agreed that this is something we're not going to do. Therefore, we all hold each other accountable as part of this social contract. And then safety mechanisms help reinforce that. So we've set our own boundaries, and if we stray outside of them, we know how to pull ourselves back in.
So, as we were talking about earlier, you've played some PBTA games like Dungeon World. You know the ins and outs of D&D, but Apocalypse World in this game was new for you. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you really dug about the system, some of the things you maybe didn't dig as much about the system, or the setting, and what surprised you there?
Yeah, I for the Powered by the Apocalypse games, I always love their flexibility, because for me, a lot of it is less about the mechanics. It's like, whereas D&D 5e feels like it's very much about the mechanics. A lot of DMs will be like, it's a combat simulator, and I'm like, oh, okay, like I disagree, but okay. Like I look at the Powered by the Apocalypse games as very story driven, and they and that's so all the mechanics in the game support the telling of a story. If you try to play the game purely mechanically, there's nothing there, because it's like, what is it like? We look at some of the moves that each class gets. They're like, I keep going back to Vector because he stands out so much, but it's like fingers in every pie. That move doesn't exist without the framework of the world, and it doesn't exist without the framework of the story. Whereas a perception check in D&D can happen. It could happen in my room. I could do a perception check,
Yeah.
Whereas, and then you look at like sort of the classes they set up, like the Battle Babe, the Skinner, like the way they set up the class system. Those can only exist within this world, and all of those character choices must be story driven. It's like, because you look at it and you go, they've got some cool moves, but why do I want to play this character? What draws me to this character? Why am I drawn to play a hard holder versus an angel? And because it's even less about like, oh well, I want, like, if you take even like classic MMORPG, it's like, am I gonna tank? Am I gonna deeps? Am I gonna support? Like, you sort of take that out of it and go, well, what about this?
Yeah.
This aesthetic has drawn me in, and what it's more about what they can do in the world versus what their function is, which is a very like small distinction. And so that was something I really dug, and I really did appreciate the creativity put into the creation of that framework, and the fact that you can then take that and shape it to your needs. So like one of the things I think I didn't like was sort of the edginess, like the edgelordness of it's like, yeah, you're gonna have sex, and it's gonna, and like, I was like, okay, like this is kind of a little red pilly for me, but like we take it and we run with it in our own direction, and we wound up with a cast of cinnamon rolls. like in the apocalypse. And I thought that was a perfect example of like, here's the framework, and we as a group choose what we accept and reject about it. So we rejected the downright grittiness of it and decided as a group that we were really telling a story about hope and surviving the apocalypse as a team, rather than, you know, everyone's trying to kill everyone. Like, we even, you know, assassins show up later in the session, and they're just sort of like, I'm just trying to survive, I'm just trying to do my job, like, no hard feelings against you, it's just someone wants you dead. You know. And it's like, so even it's less about like, oh yes, I love the killing so much, you know. It's like, they're like, nope, I just got a job to do, and this just happens to be the skills I have, which is what I think the apocalypse would be. And it's very hopeful, I'm sure. But that is what we decided on really as a group. It's like, we want these kind of stories. We want something more wholesome, despite the grittiness of the setting.
Well, pulling back a bit to the question of sex, which I know as a group internally, Nick, Percy, and I, when we were talking about this system, there were some flags raised about like, there's a sex mechanic. That feels weird. And at session 0, we as a group were talking about like the things that we did or didn't want in the campaign as a group, or rather y'all were. I was not part of that conversation. I just listened in and loved it. But because of the very queer and sex positive world that you set up, there are a number of instances of like people fooling around with other people in this campaign, and it never felt like the way the sex moves are described in Apocalypse World, because it becomes very transactional in nature, like explicitly transactional. I think that for a number of people has the like ick factor, and that never felt true for any of the scenes where sex came into play in your campaign. And so given session 0, I was surprised that we even like got to sex, because people seemed like there was some skudginess about the sex moves and the stuff. And instead, because of the environment that you set up and gave people like freedom to explore in a safe way, I thought it was like, I don't know, charming? Is charming the right word for that? I don't know. But it was really lovely to see these characters getting to explore that with NPCs in ways that didn't feel icky the way sometimes the game makes it feel like it should feel icky.
Yeah, I feel like the game set it up to, again, be like very edgy. It's like, oh yeah, in this world people fuck. And I'm like, okay, cool. Like they do in our world too. So like there's nothing special about that. And so what I worked to do was sort of remove the icky factor by being lighthearted about it and being friendly and happy. So, and that was sort of like part of the motivation behind sort of the sex positive, you know, where it's like, sex positive doesn't mean like, oh yeah, everyone must have sex. And like, so in a sense, we removed the power of the mechanic of the sex moves and made it more about the story that they were telling. So it's like, hey, you're flirting real hard with this person, and they're like, oh yeah, I want to go to your bedroom, and then fade to black. You know, like, we're not be like, now describe everything you did in excruciating detail for the podcast listeners. Like, that's not what we wanted. So
right.
And that's why I think we talked about veils and lines, you know, where it's like in the session 0, where it's like, if we do get to an instance where sex happens, we all know that I'm not going to be like, now tell me what they smell like. It's going to be like, it's like, there's going to be a veil. We both agree that you and this NPC have gone off somewhere to do whatever you do in private, you know, and it might be, it's whatever you want. It might even just be cuddling. I don't know, you know, but because we've drawn that
just hold hands and cuddle. It's fine.
Yeah, but we drew the veil there. So that becomes respecting the privacy of that character as well. You know, and by respecting the privacy of that character, I think we respect the privacy and wishes of the player. Because, again, there's such a thin line between character and player. And so it's sort of like, I mean, think about it like this. Like, in real life, if your friends are like, okay, we're gonna go have sex now, do you be like, I want to follow you and record in detail everything you do? Like, we don't do that, typically. No kink shaming if you do, you know, if that's your thing. But it's like, you know, that we respect our friends' privacy when it comes to sexual matters. And if they choose to tell us, they have chosen to tell us. We are not asking them to, you know. And so I feel the same way about characters. It's sort of, you know, the violence is inherent to the game because there's a lot of mechanics about combat and vehicle combat and this, that. And that's where we can get our action spice, you know, watching these characters be, you know, heroic and swashbuckly and murdery. But like the sex is not agreed upon in the same way. So like, let's give them the privacy they deserve, you know?
Totally. And we talked about this a little earlier, and again, we're recording this after the campaign has finished recording, but can you talk a little bit more about the JonJon expanded universe and these characters from previous campaigns that might pop up in this campaign?
Yeah, so, well, it began with the Dungeon World campaign where I built, like I said, the 6 Kingdoms of Yulia, and I built a small pantheon, and something I was very proud of in that is that each of the kingdoms had its own pantheon of 6. But it was just the same gods with different names, because each one had their own culture. And I was like, oh, so why wouldn't they, if they're all worshiping the same gods, why wouldn't they have their own names for it based on their indigenous languages before calling them, you know? And so I also set up something called like the Circle of Archmagi, which existed. There were like 9 Archmagi who existed sort of there. They were just there, and they popped up once in a while to do stuff. And then when I built the World of Cathan, which was the next long campaign I ran, I was like, I'm going to take Yulia, who was the goddess of justice, whom that continent was named after, and make her the central religious figure of this world. Like, there's still a full pantheon, but she is the most predominantly worshipped in this country that is like fantasy England. And some of my players came from that earlier Dungeon World campaign into this one. So it was like a fun Easter egg for them realizing that, oh man, these are the same gods. And then some of them, when they DM'd, were like, hey, I'm going to use my long-lived character from that campaign as a cameo in this one. And so some of the characters from that campaign started showing up in ours. And it was an Easter egg for the people who were there before, you know, and still, so that's that sort of like lenticular design, right? Where it's like, the new players will enjoy them because they're characters. The old guard who have knowledge of the old game will enjoy it that extra little bit more because they have already a history with that character. And so while I was running this 2-year-long Cathan campaign, I was DMing one-shots for a bunch of other people and different groups, and I just started weaving it all together and making sure that they were all tied to this same universe. So I have the whole planet is called Glazia Utsa, right? And then I did some astrophysical calculations to make sure it was in a habitable zone away from that galaxy's star, and then like that solar system star, so I could have a weird calendar of 16 months with 3 weeks each month. And I was like, okay, gotta make sure this all lines up in my head, otherwise it doesn't work. And so while we were recording Apocalypse World, I was also playing a game of Masks, which is another Powered by the Apocalypse game. And so in my head, I was like, man, I wonder if our Apocalypse World game is actually the future of my Cathan world. And then the Masks world is the future of the Apocalypse world, where, like, you know, the world is irradiated, so superpower has become traditional as we've rebuilt from that. You know, so I was like, so that was, it's like, it doesn't quite hold up because of like locations and the like, because our Apocalypse world is, you know, DC is based in DC. And I was like, man, DC wouldn't really exist in this because America wouldn't exist. So if you dramaturgically pick it apart, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But spiritually, for me, it's very helpful because then I always have this world with the same sort of queer positivity, sex positivity, POC forward sort of worlds that constant and that unifying spirituality exists in the world. You know, and it allows, you know, you have your same broad scope of villains and heroes and people, everyone in between, but it's like they all exist under the same umbrella. And so for me, it's like everything exists in the same world, which feels good. It just feels good because then, so we have a couple characters from the Cathan campaign who in new reincarnations show up in the Apocalypse world. as sort of my like, because you know my love of reincarnation, right? Where it's like these are spiritually the same characters from Cathan that were created by my player characters who showed up in the Apocalypse world. And when I told my players about it, they were so titillated because they were like, oh man, like this character has a new life, like, but has the same motivation. So there's the character, you know, Angie, who shows up in Apocalypse world, who her main arc in Cathan was, you know, her original arc was finding her fiance. And so in Apocalypse World, she shows up. She's looking for her fiance. You know, it's the same character. She's got the big mole on her back. She's like, you know, Southern accent, happy-go-lucky, ready to go, ready to smash things if she needs to. You know, and same motivation. And she's just there, you know, and the characters were, you know, I told the people who created Adra and Isabel, who will show up later in Apocalypse World as well, I was like, they did not like you. They did not trust you at all. And they were like, good, they shouldn't trust me. You know, it's for me, like, so the characters in this world, you know, they'll likely show up in other games as well, too, because now their spirits sort of exist in the Jon Jon Joe universe. They are part of the zeitgeist, as it were. They are part of the world, and they are part of its vocabulary. And so, you know, a Vector will show up one day. A Vance Holliday will show up in another game. You know, a Sydney and Phytotech will probably show up somewhere else in a new form. You know, it's you know, it's a way of honoring, homaging, and loving the characters that were created. And that goes back to my DM philosophy, which I don't think I stated explicitly, is sort of like, you know, it's be a fan of the characters. I always want to be a fan of them, and I want them. My DMing is designed to push their stories. It is to challenge them. It is to help them grow, because I want them to experience things. And you know, so it's trying to give as loving a mix of like fun things, of moments where they're awesome, and moments that challenge them, moments where they're like, I want them to shine in every way possible. And I also want them, you know, like, you know, when you watch a movie and your favorite character is messing up and you're like, oh, why? You're so much better than this. Like, I want those moments too. I want people to look at their characters and go, why did you do that? Oh, you're so, I know, ooh, you know, I want all the dramatic moments, and I want all the dramatic growth for the characters. So I build the framework of the world, people build their characters, and then we work together to tell those character stories. I using the world and they using their characters. And I that's what I want. I just want to further people's stories.
I think that's a lovely place to leave it for today. Thank you so much for joining us for this interview. And we'll see you next week when we dive back into Apocalypse World.
So excited. All right.
Dungeons and Drama Nerds is produced by Todd Brian Backus, Percy Hornak, and Nick Orvis, and is mixed and edited by Anthony Sertel Dean. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at DN Drama Nerds. Check out our cast bios on our website, dungeonsanddramanerds.com, and tune in next week for another episode of Dungeons and Drama Nerds.